What would you do if the only thing standing between you and the street was a chisel you barely knew how to use? What if the one person who believed in you was already gone, and everything they left behind fit inside a canvas sack you could carry on one shoulder? Pull up a chair and settle in close. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. We'd love to know you're out there. As we tell the story of Seraphine Audet and the crumbling mill house at the end of Harrow Inlet Road. Seraphine Audet was 22 years old when she arrived in the town of Dunmore's Landing, with a borrowed coat, a week's worth of bread wrapped in cloth, and a leather sack that clinked when she walked. The clink was the tools: 12 carving chisels, 2 gouges, a mallet with a cracked handle wrapped in cord, and a draw knife worn smooth at the grip. They had belonged to her teacher, old Bertrand Coe, a woodcarver, who had lived alone at the edge of the Saguenay, and spent 30 years turning fallen cedar into things that made people go quiet when they looked at them. He had taken Seraphine in when she was 15, and her father's second wife had decided there was no longer room in the house for a girl who wasn't hers. Bertrand had asked nothing of her except attention. She had given him everything she had. He died in February, 2 weeks after the ice went out on the river, sitting in his chair by the window with a piece of half-finished linden wood still in his hands. The carving was a heron in flight. He never finished it. Seraphine wrapped it carefully in canvas and put it at the bottom of the tool sack before she packed up the rest. She left nothing behind. There was nothing worth keeping. Dunmore's Landing sat at the mouth of a small inlet on the north shore, the kind of town that had been important once when the lumber trade ran thick along the river and had spent the last 20 years quietly forgetting that fact. The docks were still there, but half the boats were gone. The sawmill that had given the town its first breath of life had closed a decade ago, and the building itself had been sliding toward the water ever since. People called it the old Cormie Mill, though no one named Cormie had lived in the county for years. It sat at the end of Harrow Inlet Road, half a kilometer past the last house, and the only people who went near it anymore were children daring each other to touch the door. Seraphine didn't know any of this when she got off the coach. She knew only that Dunmore's Landing was far enough from her stepmother's town that she wouldn't run into anyone who knew her face. She had $14.70. She had the tools. She had a name. Bertrand had made sure she knew how to introduce herself, how to walk into a room and speak clearly and look people in the eye. And she had a skill that most people in a town like this had never thought to need. Her first stop was the post office, because post offices always knew everything. The woman behind the counter was Vera. No last name offered, none asked for, and she peered at Seraphine over a pair of wire spectacles with the particular look of a person deciding whether to be helpful or cautious. "You looking for work?" Vera asked. "I'm a woodcarver," Seraphine said. "Trained under Bertrand Coe out of St. Fulgence. I do furniture, frames, architectural detail. I can do restoration if the piece is worth it." Vera's expression shifted. Not warmth exactly, more like interest being filed away for later. "You'd want to talk to Reginald Fowler at the hardware," she said. "He keeps track of who needs what around here." Reginald Fowler was a short man with a long memory and the particular energy of someone who had been underestimated enough times to make it a personal philosophy. He listened to Seraphine's introduction without interrupting, which she appreciated, and then he looked at the tool sack on her shoulder with the practiced eye of a man who knew what quality looked like. "You have anything to show?" he asked. She reached into the sack and set the unfinished heron on the counter between them. Reginald looked at it for a long time. He reached out and turned it slightly, examining the way the feathers had been drawn out of the grain. "Who did this?" he asked. "My teacher started it," she said. "I haven't touched it." He nodded, as if that was the right answer. "There's not much call for carving in a place like this," he said slowly. "People don't have the money for decorative work." He paused. "But the church has been wanting someone to restore the pew ends for 3 years and hasn't found anyone willing to come this far north. And Mildred Tanner needs her staircase balusters replaced before your winter. Half of them are rotted through." He looked at her again. "You have a place to stay?" She didn't. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "There's a room above the hardware. It's not much. A cot, a window, a stove that works if you treat it right. You can have it in exchange for helping me sort the inventory this week. After that, you're on your own." It wasn't charity, the way he offered it. It was a transaction, clean and practical, and Seraphine accepted it the same way. She set up her small space above the hardware that night. The tool sack hung on a hook by the door where she could see it from the cot. The stove worked exactly as Reginald had described. Temperamentally, but honestly. She lay awake listening to the water sounds of the inlet and thought about Bertrand, the way he used to say that wood already knew what it wanted to be. Your job is just to get out of the way. She missed him with a sharpness that surprised her even now. But missing him didn't have anywhere to go, so she let it settle, the way you let a piece soak before you work it. The church job came through the following week. Father Thomas Bernier was a practical man who cared more about whether the work would hold than whether the person doing it was a man or a woman or 22 or 60, which Seraphine recognized immediately as a rare quality and was grateful for it. The pew ends were badly damaged. Years of damp and neglect had eaten into the softwood panels, and someone at some point had tried to repair them with the wrong kind of filler, which had only made things worse. She spent a morning assessing, and then went back to Reginald's with a list of what she'd need. She was carrying lumber samples out of the back of the store when she first heard the name. The old cormy mill again, a man was saying at the front counter. Wendell Goss had his boy go out there last week, said the west wall is starting to lean. Shame, Reginald said in the tone of someone who didn't find it much of a shame. Goss wants the property. Says he'd tear it down for the land, use the timber for the new barn he's been planning. But the county still holds the deed on account of the back taxes. He offered $200. County said no. Why'd they say no? A pause. Nobody quite knows. Old Mercier in the assessor's office won't move on it. People say he's being stubborn for the sake of it. Seraphine set the lumber down and went back for more. She filed the conversation away without thinking much of it. But she thought of it that night, lying on the cot. A mill, a building with timber bones, falling apart at the edge of the water, a place nobody wanted. She told herself it was none of her business. She told herself that for 4 more days, before she walked out to the end of Harrow Inlet Road to look. The mill was worse than she'd pictured and better than she'd feared, which she would later understand, was the particular way abandoned places tended to reveal themselves. The west wall had indeed begun to lean, pulled slowly earthward by years of frost heaving and neglect. The roof over the main floor had partially collapsed, leaving a ragged hole through which she could see the sky. The great wheel was long gone, only its mounting hardware remaining, rusted into something almost sculptural against the stone foundation. The door hung at an angle, one hinge sheared clean off. But the bones, she stood in the doorway for a long time without going in, just looking. The bones of the place were Douglas fir and pine, and the heavy timbers that framed the main structure were old growth, the kind you couldn't get anymore. The wood had weathered and darkened, but it had not rotted, not in the load-bearing members. The stone foundation was solid. The chimney at the north end was intact. Someone, old Cormier, or his father, or the men before him, had built this place to last, and it had lasted, despite everything the years had tried to do to it. She stepped inside. The floor was a ruin of fallen plaster and debris, weeds pushing up through the cracks between the old mill planks. The light came in strangely, through the hole in the roof, and through gaps in the west wall, casting long diagonal shapes across the interior. It smelled of cold water and old wood and something underneath that she couldn't name at first. A dry, clean smell, faintly resinous. Cedar. There was cedar in the walls. Old red cedar, the kind that repelled rot and insects both. Whoever built this had known what they were doing. She found the carving on her third pass through the building. It was as on the lintel above the interior doorway, the passage between the milling floor and what must have been the storage room beyond. Cut directly into the wood, a border of interlocking leaves, and what she first took to be a simple wave pattern. She stood on a broken crate to look more closely. It wasn't a wave. It was a running river, and along the river, half hidden in the current, were small figures, a heron, a beaver, a stand of reeds with a crane perched inside them. The carving was old and dusty, and someone had painted over it at some point with a thick gray paint, most of which had flaked away. Underneath, the cuts were clean and deliberate and deeply carefully made. She stood there for a long time. She took nothing when she left, but she came back the next morning and the morning after that. On the 5th day, she went to the county assessor's office and asked to see Alphonse Mercier. He was a small, elderly man with a meticulous desk and the air of someone who had been patient for so long it had become indistinguishable from stubbornness. He looked at Seraphine with the careful blankness of a man who had learned to reveal nothing before he knew what he was dealing with. "I'd like to inquire about the Cormier Mill property," she said. "The tax deed on Lot 14, Harrow Inlet Road." Mercier's expression didn't change. "That property is not currently available. I understand Wendell Goss made an offer of $200. Mr. Goss's offer was noted. I'd like to make a counteroffer." Seraphine said. She had thought about this for 3 nights. She had the church money coming, and the Tanner staircase job after that, and she had $14 now minus what she'd spent on food and the lumber she'd needed. She had, when she counted carefully, $112.30 to her name. $100, she said, with a written commitment to restore the structural integrity of the building within 2 years and to maintain the property going forward. Mercier looked at her for a long moment. You understand the building requires significant repair. I've assessed it myself. You're a builder? I'm a woodcarver, but I know timber. She met his eyes. The load-bearing members are sound. The foundation is solid. The west wall needs resetting, and the roof needs rebuilding, but the bones of that place are old-growth fir and cedar. If they come down for a barn, they're gone forever. If someone repairs them, they'll last another 100 years. Something shifted in Mercier's face. Not much, just enough. Leave me your details, he said. I'll look into the matter. She walked back out onto the street, into the thin October sunlight, her heart hammering in a way she didn't entirely understand. She had just offered most of what she owned for a collapsing building she had no real plan for. Bertrand would have laughed. Then he would have said, "The wood knows what it wants to be. Your job is to get out of the way." She got the deed 3 weeks later. $100, tax title, conditional on structural restoration. The clerk who processed the paperwork was young and couldn't quite conceal his amusement. "You know what people call that place," he said, as he handed her the document. "I know what people called it," she said. "I'll be changing that." She walked out into the cold with the deed in her coat pocket, and the wind off the inlet cut through her like a blade. And she felt, for the first time since Bertrand died, like she was standing on ground that was entirely her own. Word moved through Dunmore's landing the way it always does in small towns. Faster than walking, slower than the truth. By the next morning it was known that the girl staying above Fowler's Hardware had bought the Cormier mill. By afternoon the shape of the gossip had acquired detail. She heard it first in the hardware store, where she was buying new mortar and a supply of cedar shingles. 2 men near the window, not troubling to lower their voices. $100 for that wreck, the first one said. She'd have done better burning the money for warmth. She's from away, the second said, as if this explained everything. Doesn't know what winters do up here. Henderson's dry goods was worse. The woman behind the counter, cheerful, with the particular brightness of someone passing on news they consider a public service, leaned forward and said, in the confidential tone of genuine concern, "My dear, that property floods in the spring thaw. The whole inlet backs up, and that low road goes under every March without fail. You haven't made a mistake you can't recover from, but you should know now rather than later." Seraphine thanked her for the information and bought her flour and her salt, and left. The worst was Wendell Goss. She was loading supplies into the handcart outside the store when his wagon pulled up alongside her. He was a broad man, well-dressed for the season, with the settled authority of someone who had been the largest personality in most rooms for a long time. He looked down at her from the wagon seat with the expression of a man surveying a minor inconvenience. "You're the one who bought the Cormier place," he said. "Not a question." "I am," she kept loading. "I offered $200 for it," he said. "That's twice what you paid, and twice what it's worth. The county turned me down for reasons I still don't fully understand." He paused, letting that land. "I'll give you $150 for it right now. You'd walk away with $50 clear profit and save yourself a winter of trying to hold that roof up." Seraphine straightened and looked at him. "I'm not interested in selling, Mr. Goss." His eyes narrowed slightly. He had the look of a man unaccustomed to brief refusals. "You're going to rebuild that mill on a carver's wages," he said, and the word carver came out with a particular flatness that was worse than open contempt. "I'm going to try," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, quietly enough that only she could hear, "There's no water rights anymore. The water table's dropped. You can't run a mill without water. Whatever you're planning on dry land." He clicked his tongue at the horse and the wagon rolled on. She stood in the street with the cart half loaded and the wind coming off the water. And she let his words sit inside her the way cold settles into old joints. He might be right. She didn't know about the water rights. She hadn't known to ask. That evening, she sat by the stove in the room above the hardware and turned the deed over in her hands and thought about everything she didn't know. She was 22 years old. She had learned to carve from an old man who talked to wood. She had $112 minus 100 minus the supplies she'd just bought. She had 12 chisels and a mallet and a draw knife and the unfinished heron sitting on the windowsill, watching her with one blank wooden eye. She thought about what Bertrand had done when a piece wasn't going right. He'd set it down, make tea, and go outside and look at something else for a while. He said you couldn't force the grain, you had to learn what was already there. She picked up the deed and read every line of it. And then she read it again. The water rights weren't mentioned. That meant they weren't transferred. But it also meant they hadn't been extinguished. Goss had said the water table had dropped. He hadn't said the water was gone. She put the deed down and went to sleep. The next morning, she went back to the mill with a different kind of attention. She wasn't looking at the walls or the roof or the timbers today. She was looking at the ground. She walked the perimeter of the property slowly, watching the way the land lay, noticing where the frost had heaved and where it hadn't. On the east side of the building, partly hidden under 15 years of brush and fallen leaves, she found the remains of an old drainage channel. Stone-lined, hand-dug, running from somewhere up the slope toward the building's foundation. She followed it uphill. 40 meters from the mill, under a tangle of alder scrub, she found the spring. It was small, barely a seep really, but it was there, and it was moving. Not much. Enough. She went back down to the mill and looked at the old wheel housing. The channel fed to a cistern that had partially collapsed. But the cistern, like the foundation, was stone. Stone could be rebuilt. She sat down on a fallen timber and laughed. Not the performance of laughter, but the real thing, sudden and involuntary, the kind that comes out of you when you realize the problem was never as large as the dark made it seem. She worked on the church pew ends through November, shaping new panels in cherry wood to match the old profiles, fitting them so carefully that Father Mas Bernier stood in the doorway of the church one morning and said quietly that if he hadn't watched her do the work, he'd have thought the pews had always been that way. He paid her that afternoon, in full, without fuss. She was grateful for both the money and the absence of ceremony. She spent her early mornings at the mill. She had no help for the heavy work, not yet, and so she worked within what she could do alone. She shored up the leaning west wall, with temporary bracing, working from plans she drew herself at the hardware store's counter, on slow afternoons. She cleared the debris from the floor, piece by piece, wheelbarrow load by wheelbarrow load, the work brutal and slow and deeply satisfying, in the way that only the most straightforward physical labor can be. She began uncovering the original mill floor. Wide pine planks, scarred and stained but whole, and she cleaned them by hand on her knees with a wire brush and linseed oil. The tool sack came with her every morning. On the days when the heavy work was done, and she had an hour before the light failed, she would climb the broken crate to the lintel carving and work on uncovering it. Carefully, patiently, with the finest chisel and a soft cloth, she removed what remained of the gray paint. The carving emerged slowly, the way things emerge when you stop trying to rush them. The heron, the beaver, the reeds, and there, near the eastern corner of the border, something she hadn't seen before. A woman's hands, cupped together, holding a seedling, small, precise, almost hidden in the running river pattern. She stopped breathing for a moment when she found it. She thought about old Cormier, whoever he was, commissioning this, or doing it himself. She thought about the care of it, the intention. This was not decoration. This was a statement about what the building was for, about who it was meant to welcome. She went home that night and sat by the stove for a long time, not reading, not working, just thinking. Reginald Fowler found her a carpenter the following week. His name was Charles Boutin, not on her list of known names, a quiet man of about 50 who had built half the houses on the west side of town and had, according to Reginald, hands that could read timber the way other men read words. He came out to the mill on a gray November morning and walked a building in silence for 20 minutes before he said anything. "The west wall's salvageable," he said finally. "You'll need to take it down 2 courses and reset it from there. The plate at the top is still good. Can you do it?" He looked at her. "Not alone. I'm not paying you to work alone," she said. "I'm paying you to know what to do. I can be the other pair of hands." He considered this for a moment. He had the look of a man recalculating. "Your wall, your rules," he said, and that was the beginning of it. They worked through November and into the first cold weeks of December. Seraphine kept the church job and the Tanner balusters running alongside the millwork, the money feeding back into materials. She was up before dawn most mornings, ate standing up, fell asleep each night with the particular depth of someone whose body has been fully used. She was not unhappy. She had not been this not unhappy in a long time. She told Reginald about the spring, and he sent her to talk to a woman named Ada Price, who ran a small market garden at the edge of town and knew the local water table better than anyone in the county. Ada Price was 70 years old, spare and blunt, and she walked the mill property with Seraphine on a gray afternoon and prodded the earth at intervals with a long iron rod. "The spring is fed from the ridge," she said. "It's been there longer than the town." The Cormier family tapped it, but they didn't dig deep enough. The cistern they built was too small. She looked at Seraphine. "If you deepen the channel and build a proper cistern, not large but right, you'd have reliable water year-round. Not enough to run a mill wheel, enough for a workshop, enough for a garden." "A garden," Seraphine repeated. Ada looked at her steadily. "What did you think you were building?" Seraphine didn't have an answer for that, not one that was fully formed. She was building what? A home, a workshop, a place. She kept circling the same uncertain center of the thing without quite arriving at it. "Come see mine," Ada said, and they walked back through the cold to her property. Ada Price's garden in winter was a study in structure. Raised beds of dark soil, careful mulching, a small glass-paned cold frame with the remnants of late greens inside. But it was the drying shed that stopped Seraphine. Long bundles of dried herbs hung from the rafters. She recognized lavender, sage, a dozen others she didn't have names for, and the air inside was thick with a smell that was somehow warm despite the cold, complex and clean and alive. "Most of this goes to Dr. Sinclair," Ada said. "He uses it for the clinic. Some goes to families who can't afford the pharmacy." She was watching Seraphine carefully. "The demand is always more than I can grow. I'm not getting younger." Seraphine looked at the drying bundles, at the order of the small shed, at the light coming through the low winter sun into the cold frame. She thought about the mill, the spring, the stone cistern that could be rebuilt. The south-facing wall that she'd already noted caught light in a way the interior didn't. She thought about Bertrand, about the things he'd passed down not by explaining them, but by doing them in front of her, until she understood. "Some knowledge lives in the hands," he'd said once. "It doesn't come out through the mouth. It comes out through the work." She looked at Ada. "Would you be willing to teach me?" she said. Ada Price looked at her for a long moment. Then she made a sound that might have been a laugh, though it was short and dry enough that it was hard to be certain. "Come back in the spring," she said. "Bring your shovels." December arrived hard, the way it does on the North Shore, not gradually but all at once, as if the cold had been patient long enough. The inlet froze from the edges inward. The road to the mill turned to iron. Seraphine finished the last of the Tanner staircase work and banked her wages carefully. Charles Boutin helped her close up the west wall before the worst of the cold hit, the two of them working in heavy coats with their breath fogging in the air, fitting the reset stones back with a speed born of necessity. The wall stood. She stood back and looked at it in the gray afternoon light, and felt the quiet satisfaction of a thing done right. The storm came on the third night of December, off the St. Lawrence, the kind that doesn't announce itself until it's already arrived. Seraphine was in the room above the hardware when the wind picked up, and the temperature dropped 20 degrees in under an hour. She banked the stove and listened to the building creak, and thought involuntarily about the mill. The repaired wall, the temporary roof bracing over the east end, the old window openings she'd shuttered but not yet glazed. She heard the sound just before midnight. Not a human sound, a lower sound, carried on the wind, the groan of something structural under strain. She was dressed and out the door before she'd fully decided to go, the lantern lit, the cold hitting her like a wall. The road to the mill was already drifting, the wind tearing at her coat, the lantern throwing a wild, swinging light. She kept her head down and walked. The east gable had partially blown in. The temporary bracing had held the wall itself, but the shutter over the large opening had gone, and snow was driving in through the gap. She assessed quickly. The wall was not in danger. The floor would be damaged if she left it. She went in and spent 2 hours in the dark and the cold, working by lantern light, nailing new bracing over the opening with boards she'd stored inside for exactly this kind of emergency. Her hands went numb and she warmed them against the lantern glass in turns. The cold didn't make her angry. She had expected something like this. Old buildings ask you to prove yourself. She was finishing the last nail when she heard the noise outside. Not the wind, something different, a human sound, high and frightened. She lifted the lantern and fought her way to the door. On the road, 20 meters down from the mill, a horse stood loose and trembling, its reins dragging in the snow. Beside it, in the ditch, a figure was trying to rise and couldn't. Seraphine got to them in seconds. A young woman, perhaps 16, her coat too light for this weather, one leg bent at an angle that explained why she couldn't stand. Her face was white with cold and pain. "I can't." The horse shied at something, the girl managed. Don't try to move, Seraphine said. She looked at the leg. Not broken, she thought, or not badly. The angle was from the fall, not from the bone. A bad sprain, possibly worse. The cold was the immediate danger. What's your name? Nettie, the girl said. Nettie Voss. She was shaking hard. Nettie, I'm going to get you inside. I'm going to have to help you walk. It will hurt. Are you ready? The girl's jaw tightened. She nodded. Getting her to the mill took most of Seraphine's strength. The girl was light, but the snow was deep and the road was treacherous. She half-carried her through the door and settled her on the cleanest section of the pine floor, using her own coat as a pad underneath. She tied the horse inside the east doorway, where the new bracing kept the worst of the wind out. Then she got the small iron stove going. She'd installed it herself in October, second-hand from Reginald, a decision she now blessed, and got water boiling. She didn't have Ada's herbs, but she had Bertrand's habits. She'd watched him treat his own hands, his own cold-weather injuries, through years of winters on the Saguenay. She knew what heat could do, and what elevation, and what a firm wrap and stillness. She worked steadily, talking to the girl, where she was going, where she'd come from. A farm 3 kilometers east, riding back from her cousins, the storm arriving faster than expected. She kept her voice level and calm because she'd learned from Bertrand that calm was the thing you could give someone when you had nothing else. Nettie's shaking eased as the stove took hold. The ankle. It was the ankle, not the leg. She'd misjudged in the dark. Was swollen but not catastrophically. The cold had been the real danger, and the cold was receding now. You own this place, Nettie asked, after a long, warm silence. I do. The girl looked around at the rough interior, the exposed beams, the patched walls, the lantern-lit lintel carving. It's strange, she said. Not unkind, honest. It's not finished yet, Seraphine said. What will it be? Seraphine looked at the carved hands above the doorway, the cupped palms holding their small seedling. She thought about the spring on the hillside, Ada's drying shed, the south-facing wall, the things that were already here, waiting. A workshop, she said, and maybe a garden, and somewhere people can come for what they can't find elsewhere. She paused. I'm still working it out. Nettie's father arrived at first light, coming up the road on foot with a lantern, his face a map of a night's worth of fear resolved into relief. He was a broad, weathered man named Gilbert Voss, and he shook Seraphine's hand with both of his, wordlessly for a long moment. She'd have been on that road all night, he said. His voice was rough. She found the right doorway, Seraphine said. He looked at her, then at the mill, then back at her. Something in his expression recalibrated. He was a farmer, she could tell. He had the particular way of standing that comes from decades of assessing land and structures and weather with practical eyes. You're doing the restoration work yourself, with Charles Boutin helping on the heavy work. He nodded slowly. I'm a mason, he said. Not by trade, but by years. My family built half the stone walls in this county. He glanced at the east gable, the fresh bracing, her work from the night before. When spring comes, if you need someone who knows stone, for a cistern, say, or foundation work, I'd be glad to help. She looked at him. I couldn't pay you full rate. I didn't say anything about rate, he said. He carried Nettie home wrapped in borrowed blankets. The horse followed without needing to be led. Seraphine watched them go from the mill doorway, the cold clean, and still now that the storm had passed, the inlet glittering below through the bare trees. She went back inside and sat down on the pine floor and let the silence settle around her. It was the deepest quiet she had felt since she got here. Not empty quiet, but full of something. The stove ticked. The building breathed. Overhead, the old fir beams held the weight of the sky the way they had always held it. Spring was a long way off. There was the roof, still to rebuild, the cistern to dig, the glazing, the herb beds to prepare. 100 things she didn't yet know she'd need to do. She had less money than she'd started with, and more work than she'd planned for, and no guarantee that any of it would come out the way she imagined. But the building was standing. The wall she'd reset with Charles Boutin was holding against the cold. The spring on the hillside was still moving under the ice, and above the doorway, the old carved hands were there in the wood, patient, permanent, holding their small green thing toward the light. What happened next was not a single event but a season. Gilbert Voss arrived in April as the snow left the road, with a sledge of stone and 2 of his sons and a quiet matter-of-fact willingness to work that Seraphine recognized as the finest form of generosity. The cistern took 3 weeks. It was built right, deep, stone-lined, covered, and when the spring ran full with the melt, it filled and held, clean and cold and steady. Ada Price came in May with seeds and a bluntness that Seraphine had come to value the way she valued good tools. She walked the south wall, in the cleared ground and made a series of pronouncements without looking at Seraphine. And Seraphine listened and took notes and asked questions. And by the time Ada left that first afternoon, the outline of the herb garden was staked, and the first beds were turned. Charles Boutin brought his nephew for the roof work, and together the three of them, Seraphine, Charles, and the nephew, who was 17 and asked very good questions, rebuilt the roof over the main floor through June, the airs smelling of new timber and cedar shingles in the long light evenings. Wendell Goss rode past twice that summer. The first time, he paused at the end of the road and looked up the hill at the scaffolding and the activity and the new roof line taking shape against the sky and said nothing, and rode on. The second time, he didn't pause at all. Nettie Voss started coming on Saturday mornings, ostensibly to help with the garden, practically because she had a sharp eye for plants and an even sharper eye for what people needed, and Seraphine found her presence useful in ways she hadn't expected. Nettie was the one who noticed that old Mrs. Demers at the edge of town hadn't been out in weeks. Seraphine sent a dried herb bundle through her. She was the one who mentioned that the schoolteacher, Mr. Farrant, had been having headaches since the spring, bad enough to affect his work. Seraphine talked to Ada, who suggested something, and it helped. Word moved the way it always does, quietly at first, then all at once. By August, people were finding their way up Harrow Inlet Road without being sent. A woman whose child had a persistent cough, a fisherman with hands so cracked they bled, an old man who couldn't sleep. Seraphine didn't set herself up as anything she wasn't. She was a woodcarver who had learned from a gardener who had learned from years of living close to the ground. She said so, plainly every time. She sent people to Dr. Sinclair when the matter was beyond what she knew. She kept clear notes, the way Bertrand had kept notes on every piece he'd worked, and she checked them against Ada's knowledge and her own observation. The workshop took its full shape in September. The tools hung in their places on the wall. The carving bench sat under the north window where the light fell clean and steady. The herb drying racks lined the south wall, the bundles was hanging in long, fragrant rows. The floor, she had refinished it herself, on her knees, plank by plank over the course of a month, was smooth and dark with oil and age. She hung the heron above the workbench, still unfinished. She had decided not to finish it. It was exactly what it was. The last thing Bertrand's hands had touched, in mid-flight, caught between what it had been and what it was becoming. It belonged here. On the first cold morning of October, a year and 2 weeks since she had first walked out Harrow Inlet Road, Seraphine stood at the window of the workshop and looked down the inlet. The water was still and silver. The trees on the far shore were red and gold. Reginald Fowler had told her, a few days prior, with the careful understatement of a man not given to sentimentality, that he'd heard more than one person refer to the mill as the Audet place. Not the Cormier mill, not the Widow's Folly, not the wreck at the end of the road. The Audet place. She held her tea in both hands and looked at the water and thought about what it meant to be known somewhere. To have your name attached to a piece of land, to a building, to a kind of work. She thought about what it had cost. She thought about Bertrand, and the way that grief, which had been a sharp thing for so long, had softened without losing its shape. The way carved wood weathers, growing more itself with age, not less. She thought about the heron above the workbench, mid-flight, always becoming. She set down her tea, picked up a chisel, and went to work. If you stayed with us all the way to the end of this one, we're grateful. There's something about a place that nobody wanted. A place that waits quietly for the right pair of hands that we find ourselves coming back to. Leave us a note in the comments. Is there something you've built, or rebuilt, or held on to when the world said let it go? We'd love to hear from you. And if this story found its way to you tonight, perhaps it was meant to. We'll see you next time.